Hello, everyone. I am Carmel Shachar. I'm the Executive Director at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. I am delighted to welcome you to this session of our seminar series, COVID-19 and the Law. This is the Disparate Burdens of COVID-19. We host this seminar series with our friends and colleagues, the Solomon Center for Health Law and Policy at Yale Law School. Before I hand it over to our moderator, a few purely logistical notes. We will have a Q&A at the end of this session. The best way to submit your questions is to use the Zoom Q&A feature. We will be monitoring that and pulling questions from there. We also welcome you to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag COVIDLawPolicy. Again, that's hashtag COVIDLawPolicy. If you post a question to that hashtag, Petrie-Flom staff will see it and will pull that question into the Zoom Q&A. Please don't try to use the Zoom chat for questions or use the Zoom raise your hand feature, as we will not be monitoring that. With those logistical points out of the way, I would like to introduce our moderator and MC for the event, Ryan Knox, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Solomon Center for Health Law and Policy at Yale Law School, and will be providing us opening remarks and introducing our speakers. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Carmel. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. We're thrilled to have the fourth panel in our COVID and the Law Forum series. So the series as a whole has covered the legal, ethical, regulatory, and the broader social and institutional impacts that COVID-19 has had, as well as the longer lasting effects that it may have on our society. Today, our speakers will focus on the role that social disparities and structural forces have played and will continue to play in the COVID-19 pandemic and our responses and recovery to it. We have 6 speakers joining us today on 6 very interesting and very different topics. First, we will have Daniel Farber, the Show Sato Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at Berkeley Law. Second, we will have Joelle Brogan, Senior Lecturer in Law at Middlesex University, London, presenting her chapter co-authored with Alicia Eli Yamin. Third, we will have Aletha Maybank, who's the Chief Health Equity Officer and Group Vice President of the American Medical Association, presenting the piece she has co-authored with Scott Schweikart, Fernando De Mayo, Mia Keys, Joaquin Baca, and Brian Vandenberg. Next, we will have Judith Resnick, who's the Arthur Lyman Professor of Law at Yale Law School, presenting her chapter co-authored with Jamie Meyer and Marisol Olajuela. Then we'll have Eric Rodriguez, who's the biobehavioral epidemiologist and staff scientist for the Division of Intramural Research at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, who's presenting his piece co-authored with Eliseo Perez-Estable and Saida Correas. And finally, we will have Tess Wise, who's the Carl Lowenstein Fellow and Visiting Assistant Professor of Political Science at Amherst College, presenting the chapter she has co-authored with Gali Katz-Nelson, Carmel Shachar, and Andrea Louise Campbell. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Daniel Farber. Professor Farber, you're on mute.
You know, you'd think the number, given the fact that I spend half my time on Zoom all day, you'd think by now I would have learned to unmute myself. My topic is a little bit on the edges of the panel subject matter for today, but I guess they had trouble figuring out quite what panel I belonged with. I'm going to be talking about COVID-19 and climate change, although I won't be stressing the public health and disparities aspect. There's clear connection between climate change and public health, some of which I'll mention, and climate change also involves many of the same disparities in terms of impacts that we've seen with the impacts of COVID-19. So I think one way to start is by asking, where were we before COVID? Climate change is galloping ahead. We're already seeing some very significant signs of that. The last decade was the warmest since the Industrial Revolution. In terms of the policy side, the Paris Agreement created a roadmap, And what was most notable is that for the first time, countries like China and India agreed to play a role in controlling emissions. Before that, they were more or less saying that the responsibility was on the West. And then finally, not that long before COVID struck, Trump announced the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, which was not fine. Well, the announcement was well before, but the actual withdrawal did not take place until just before we started hearing the first news about COVID. So what I want to talk about is how COVID has changed the picture. How has COVID impacted carbon emissions? Is that effect going to last? I'm going to talk about the possibility of a green recovery in which further economic relief or stimulus will be needed. Can it be used to promote sustainability? And I would add, as the Biden administration, for example, has been very much aware of, to what extent can the stimulus be used to address social and economic inequalities? And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about COVID and climate governance. We're dealing with two global crises. What can we learn about what works and what doesn't work? So the little graph that you see here shows the price of oil, and probably the most dramatic thing is that on the far right of the graph, the price drops very briefly below zero. That is, oil producers were paying other companies to take the oil off their hands. That didn't last very long, but while it did last, it was a pretty shocking development. Here's what happened with carbon emissions. What you can see is a very sharp drop first in India, or in China, a recovery in China, but then by April, a collapse elsewhere. And then a slow return, not all the way to normal, but closer. So by year end, the world was down about 7% on total carbon emissions. And this was due to the lockdown. It's also due to the economic impact of the COVID epidemic, which shut down a fair amount of industry, has still greatly impaired air travel, et cetera. Here's a slide with some quotes from Robert Schiller. I'm not going to read them aloud, but the basic idea is we really don't have very clear ideas about the long-term impacts that pandemics or other sort of black swan events have on society, on the economy. So, we'll be trying to puzzle out, I think, for years to come, just how much difference the COVID experience will make going down the road. So we expect the economy to inch its way back to normality. I include a slide here that shows the Congressional Budget Office's prediction. And what you can see in this circled area is that they're predicting that the economy will go back more or less on track around 2024, 2025. This is very speculative, really. We can't, nobody really knows, but at least that's their indication. And what that means is we will be more or less in a recession. Until then, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the government to do something about that and bring us back more quickly. And the question is, can we use that to address climate change? So the Europeans definitely think so. The EU stimulus program includes the equivalent of almost $500 million for climate and environment, covering a whole bunch of different measures, including more renewables, batteries, other kinds of environmental issues. Germany's stimulus plan devotes about $50 billion to public transportation, electric vehicles, and renewable energy. And France is also investing some money in the hope of becoming the European leader on electric vehicles. So I think it's in Europe clearly where we see the most conscious decision to devote recovery funding to addressing the climate crisis. What about the US? Congress is currently considering a $1.9 trillion relief fund. It includes a lot of money for governments and so on and so forth, but it's designed to achieve immediate help to people rather than sort of the more long-term project to bringing the economy back. I think the best prospect for some kind of green investment will be an infrastructure bill, which the Biden people are hoping to move forward to in the spring or summer. That could provide funding for transportation like electric vehicles and for public transportation, for building greater efficiency, for the power sector, and for environmental justice, which is a major priority of the administration. But really, there's no way of knowing how that's going to work. Joe Manchin from West Virginia remains the likely swing vote in the Senate. And so really, it's unlikely that anything will get done that he doesn't approve of. So we just have to see how that plays out. Now I want to turn fairly briefly to what we've learned about governance and sort of what the parallels are between COVID and climate change and where things are different. One thing we see with COVID, and we've also seen for climate governance, is that a lot of the action is not at the international level or even the national level, but it's in states and cities. And we saw in Brazil and the US, for example, that until recently in the US, the federal government was relatively passive, and only states, Washington State, for example, and cities like New York and Sao Paulo had realistic responses, while the federal governments in both cases were AWOL. So the upside of kind of a decentralized response is that you do have the potential for a more vigorous action than national governments are willing to support. And again, that's very much true in the climate change area, looking at, say, California. But there are risks, and a part of the risk is that not everybody jumps into the vanguard, and you have states that are doing very little. For example, North Dakota in the US really seems to want to do nothing. And then you're providing breeding grounds for the virus and for the emergence of new varieties, which can affect everybody else. And the same problem with climate change governance, where we have states that are in the forefront, but we also have laggard states that are doing relatively little, and we need some kind of national action in both cases to deal with what is, after all, a national or international problem. I think the other significant governance lesson is about global cooperation, which has been sketchy in the case of COVID, I think. You would think a global pandemic would pull everyone together, and yet even within the EU, individual countries have seemed to dominate the response. And the difficulties with global cooperation were worse because of the rise of populism in the years before COVID. So we had populist leaders in Brazil, in the United States, and elsewhere, who by and large have seemed particularly uninterested in dealing with the pandemic. And I would add, also particularly uninterested in dealing with climate change. At least in the US, the virus outbreak may have helped sway the political balance a little bit and brought back a government with a greater interest in international cooperation on both fronts, rejoining the Paris Agreement, rejoining the World Health Organization. And I think what we're learning once again is how far we are from having international institutions that are really up to the job of dealing with these systemic global risks. We still have an awful lot of work to do. And I don't think either of these risks is going to stand alone. I'm confident that we will see some new global systemic risk emerging that we're not even thinking about today. And we need to start thinking about institutions to deal with it. So just a brief wrap up. The coronavirus caused a major drop in emissions. They're moving higher again. We can't really tell about long-term impacts. For example, how long will we continue to be doing conferences on Zoom or remotely, rather than going back to the old days when we would have all flown in to do an in-person presentation, and which would have been great in terms of meeting each other and talking, but obviously would have involved a lot more emissions. The crisis does create an opportunity for a green recovery. And there's actually some evidence from the recovery from the financial crisis that it's not just a matter of temporarily stimulating green investment. There are long-term consequences. There's really sort of a long-term acceleration that comes from making these big investments. COVID fits the pattern we've seen before, with individual jurisdictions taking the lead, but then with at least some backup in both cases from international institutions like the WHO. And I think the biggest unknown is how the coronavirus will affect political institutions generally and global institutions and international relations specifically. So I've kind of raced through that presentation because as the first speaker, I'm trying not to get us behind, but I'll be glad to answer more questions. And otherwise, you can find a lot more about the climate issue and also posts about COVID on our environmental law blog. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So next is Joelle Grogan.
Many thanks, many thanks. Hello from London, where it is very wet, very grey, and very miserable. So it does look like it's straight out of a Dickensian novel at the moment. It is my great privilege to be presenting a paper that was co-written with the utterly wonderful Alicia Eli-Yamin of the Petrie-Flom Center. We draw insights from our two global symposia, which ran briefly in parallel between April and June 2020. They brought together over 100 posts reporting on global governmental responses to COVID-19 in 75 countries. In this paper and in the next 15 or 16 minutes, I'm going to be tracing some of the cross-cutting themes that shed greater light on protections for civil liberty and health-related rights. The first theme that I'm going to be discussing is whether or not a constitutional state of exception, also called state of emergency, is preferable to using ordinary legislation, ordinary powers in managing the impacts on civil liberties and in a health and social crisis. Second, we will consider the role of health policymaking and health systems as democratic institutions. Ultimately, the key finding of both our symposia was that essential to understanding the very varied impacts and responses to COVID-19, as well as to consolidating democratic rule of law post-pandemic, is examining the wider context and contingencies that shape how formal legal rules function in practice. So let's first focus on the theme of states of exception and states of emergency, which I'm often asked about, even in very recent times. So first off, states of exception, or again, states of emergency, enable the exceptional use of powers by the executive outside of ordinary legislative procedures or scrutiny. They're justified on the basis of necessity of an urgent response to crisis. Now, by their very nature and by the strength of the justifying urgency which calls for their use, emergency powers are at heightened risk of misuse or even abuse, as such powers can invite risk to excessive restriction of liberties, even the benefit of the majority or political elites against minorities, or even the failure to readjust following emergency. Now, underlined in the findings of both symposia was the importance not only of ensuring the limited nature of emergency or exceptional powers, but critically, the limited use of power during emergency. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's necessary also to consider the urgency of contemporary situations, essentially the increasing executive dominance that we're witnessing across the world prior to pandemic, connected with this larger global trend towards autocratization and decay of consolidated democracies. So taking a look at the 75 countries that were examined as part of the symposia, a majority declared a state of emergency or otherwise used exceptional emergency powers within their constitutional systems. These range from highly prescriptive forms of emergency powers with differential tiers of exception requiring legislative approval and judicial oversight and judicial scrutiny, depending on the degree of severity. You can contrast Estonia, Chile, and Peru in this, to very open-ended discretionary provisions providing for exclusively executive decision on what constitutes a threat, which was often immune from any degree of oversight whatsoever. Look again at Cameroon, Malaysia, and Thailand. What is notable is that while nearly all states have acted to place highly restrictive limitations on the exercise of rights, including movement, assembly, and worship, only a minority actually derogated from international human rights instruments, which did prescribe limitations on the use of emergency powers. Derogation, for all its debate, is not a significant indicator of commitment to compliance with international or even domestic constitutional rights. And for this, we can contrast the experiences of Estonia and Chile, which, despite derogation from the ECHR and ACHR and ICCPR, respectively, still had very questionable practices in the context of their use of emergency powers. Now, by contrast, a large number of the most populous states, looking at Brazil, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and India, they all eschewed the declaration of an emergency, even where it was available to them, often for political reasons, to avoid negative historical associations, or, and I think familiar to many of you out there who lived during Trump's America, I think we all lived during Trump's America. My sense of time has completely disappeared in pandemic, but also in the underestimation or downplaying of the severity of the pandemic threat. States which did not engage emergency provisions, which did not declare states of emergency, nevertheless acted sometimes as if they were in an emergency. They relied on ordinary health legislation, but used it in extraordinary ways. What was concerning about this is that we've seen globally that any form of parliamentary legislative scrutiny was abandoned in favor of a multitude of executive decrees and presidential or ministerial circulars, which had a crisis of both legal uncertainty and public confusion, looking at Cameroon, India, Turkey for these examples. These measures, which, while emergency in effect, were not considered so in form. In effect, the practice of reliance on ersatz ordinary powers was the avoidance of safeguards which we'd otherwise expect to see in the exercise of emergency powers. The commonality exposed is that without a requisite degree of democratic oversight or input, the negative consequences which can arise both under states of emergency and upon reliance on ordinary powers, ordinary legislation, are all but indistinguishable. What I do want to highlight is that whether or not a state of emergency has been declared is not a reliable indicator of potentially abusive practices. We can look at the targeting of vulnerable populations and compare the experiences of Slovakia, Peru, and Kenya in declaring and not declaring a state of emergency. But key for me right now, sitting in Europe, is that we can see the experiences of the autocratizing states of Hungary, which declared a state of emergency, successive states of emergency, and Poland, which did not. Both took advantage. They used COVID-19 pandemic as a catalyst to further consolidate power within the executive. Not to be all gloomy, we do have some evidence of good practices, which are not dependent on the emergency ordinary powers dichotomy. Those states which have aligned law and policy with principles of legal certainty, of clarity in communication, of scrutiny, of transparency, but critically of the publication of rationale, the rationalizing justifications for use of actions and powers, as well as engagement with external expertise, more often correlated with higher levels of public trust and compliance. We need only to look at the experiences and actions of Australia, of Finland, of Iceland, of South Korea, of Taiwan, and of New Zealand. However, to quote my wonderful co-author, as she wrote in the symposium, political trust needs to be continually earned, and traditions of transparency are deeply ingrained. They do not begin in pandemics. With this in mind, we can now focus on the second theme, that of health policy and health institutions as democratic institutions. The pandemic has brought far greater attention to connections between public health and public health systems on one hand, and the democratic legitimacy of government actions on the other. Reflections of both symposia suggest that it's insufficient to examine whether health-related rights are enshrined directly in constitutional norms. Instead, it's critical to understand that the structural conditions are those that enable health-related rights to be exercised in practice. It's unsurprising that despite health rights being enshrined in constitutional law in each case, and in a majority of the countries studied in both symposia, when countries with well-functioning healthcare systems, particularly where that healthcare system is considered sacrosanct in political culture, I'm looking at you, Canada, they're inevitably better placed to tackle major health crises than those with weak or dysfunctional health systems. Looking to South Africa, Argentina, or Colombia, or even those systems that are already in a state of total collapse or decline, as in Ecuador or Nepal. We need for the international and comparative law community to pay closer attention, not just to the grafting of rights onto domestic law, but to real structural institutional change. The symposia further highlight the importance of decision-making processes in relation to health and the meaningfulness of health rights in practice, as well as to the preservation of democratic legitimacy. Defining the contours of health entitlements inexorably involves contestation of the boundaries of public policy and private morality, between individual and social responsibility, and among competing social values. Decision-making processes regarding health within health systems and beyond had largely been exiled from democratic deliberation to insulated islands of professional expertise. Now, as a result, during the pandemic, we have witnessed the widespread adoption of an overly simplistic dichotomy of objective scientific truth versus political power, coupled with very considerable polarization in a number of countries. And again, we can look to the US and to Brazil. In both symposia, this dichotomy has become encapsulated in the tension of who is or who should be the decision maker, marking often radical reformulations of roles. For example, here in Europe, we saw doctors becoming and acting as politicians in Croatia, and public opinion acting as epidemiologists in the Netherlands. Measures implemented to slow the spread of the virus have had a disproportionately negative impact on vulnerable populations, including the elderly, prisoners, persons with physical or mental disabilities, migrants, racial and ethnic minorities, refugees, and migrant workers. Even across countries of different wealth and income levels, Spain, Ireland, Chile, Colombia, Kenya, sudden onset of mass unemployment of part-time and informal workers, the shutdown of childcare and schools, and stay-at-home orders led to a spike in domestic violence and a devastating impact on women. But looking even beyond to the millions living in poverty with malnutrition and cramped conditions with limited access to water, the most prevalent political and medical messaging coming globally of stay home and wash your hands has ignored endemic socioeconomic disparity and the underlying social inequalities which have enabled and embedded it. There is no reason to believe that public health expertise offers a privileged domain of knowledge in weighing the containment of transmission against losing access to other socioeconomic rights and basic needs of food, of housing, of education, cloaked in an aura of objective apolitical scientificity and justified under the idea of safeguarding an unchallengeable good, which is made to appear a heightened necessity when coupled with a generalized fear. These prescriptions are insulated from normal democratic deliberation. Further, the fallaciously denominated health versus wealth trade-off, that's public health restrictions versus opening the economy, have in many countries involved dueling fields of expertise and calculations of cost-benefit between economists and public health experts, as opposed to enlarging our imagination of how decisions regarding health can be brought into the realm of public reason. Across societies, evidence suggests that the social legitimacy of health decisions is based on both socio-historical context and, in the case of local health systems, the slow building of trust. Again, to keep echoing Alicia and what we've seen in both symposia, this does not happen overnight. This is something that is built. The critical role of reasoned justification for how health systems function has often been evidenced by its absence during COVID-19. Again, decisions regarding what services are deemed essential have often disproportionately affected sexual and reproductive health rights. But we can also look to the best practices, those practices that should be embedded and echoed and built into new ways of looking and seeing these systems. These include the explicit justification and transparency of rationales, the transparency of empirical and normative uncertainty, openness to address and include diverse perspectives in competing criteria for decisions, the inclusion of perspectives of marginalized and disadvantaged populations as to the formulation of choice criteria, willingness to revise policy decisions in light of populations' negative experiences, but further and beyond the regulation and enforcement of all of these. In sum, the effectiveness as well as legitimacy of governmental responses to COVID-19 call for thinking more deeply about the role of health systems as democratic and social institutions, and the ways that these can formally and informally enshrine normative values from macro to micro levels. In sum, these two global symposia provide three essential insights for building stronger democratic institutional structures to withstand the pressures both of pandemic and also of autocratizing forces. First, the use of power within a wider sociopolitical context and not the form of legal authority should be the starting point for reimagining democratic controls to contain abuses of civil liberties. Second, the institutional arrangements and structural conditions necessary to ensure access to public health as well as medical care are as important as formal legislative regimes enshrining health-related rights. Third, and finally, democratic decision-making processes that include participation by a wide array of experts as well as affected constituencies afford space to critique government action. These are critical for outcomes and preserving the rule of law. Thank you, and I warmly welcome questions, particularly to my co-author Alicia, who will be joining during the Q&A.
Thank you so much. So next we'll have Dr. Maybank.
All right. Here we go. Great, and great to join everyone today. And I'm going to be talking and discussing our group's submission from our group and team from the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association, for those who don't know, is the largest and considered one of the more powerful physician organizations in the country. It's been around for 174 years. And we really support efforts around lots of advocacy as it relates to the healthcare system, and we've had for a very long time. I specifically have come on board as the inaugural Chief Health Equity Officer, and I've been around for about 2 years now, and really working to help facilitate a process to embed equity and justice across all aspects of the American Medical Association. And so I'm here to speak through and highlight what we think is important and critical to really consider as we move into this time of the pandemic and after the pandemic, and the critical nature of clearly some technical aspects of how we do equity work. But really, I think rooted in that, and this is really building off of the presentation before, which I highly valued, is that we have to be able to name some truths about this country that have often been hidden and not talked about and very uncomfortable for people to discuss. But these truths have absolutely determined and created the lens through which policy and structures are built within this country. And so I'm going to highlight about, the naming of racism within the current epidemic. What are some political pivot points that have happened historically and currently? And then what does this mean for law and policy moving forward? And so this is first just showing some data as it relates to COVID-19. We know that the inequitable burden of COVID-19 has been well established. The earliest studies really came in April 2020 and warned of a disproportionate cost for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in this country. And health equity experts really warned that COVID-19 would amplify these existing inequities as it spread, throughout the country. And as the United States really crossed its threshold of 500,000 deaths from COVID-19, we continue to see significant inequities that were revealed early in the weeks. And the latest data really just demonstrate here that Pacific Islanders, Latinx, Indigenous, and Black people are more than double that of white to have died from COVID-19. And so early on in the pandemic, and I really talk about this context of narrative and the story that's told, that oftentimes, if we're not careful, and will completely undermine our efforts for justice and equity. And so a lot of the narrative that was in our media was really around, higher rates of diabetes and obesity and hypertension, not really focusing on the structural context of what was elevated in the previous presentation. And it wasn't a sufficient explanation. And so it really was our health equity experts, as well as people who are experiencing injustice, who really elevated that we have to look deeper than that. We have to have a better analysis that was looking at poverty and crowded housing and our racialized, segregated systems of almost everything within this country. And that we need to really focus on not just race as a risk factor, because it's not the risk factor, it's really the experience that communities have had with racism over generations within this country. And I really, I'm a public health person, and I think really important to this frame, as many folks have learned to during this time and have been exposed to what public health even means, is that we have to have a greater context to public health to really understand why we have to focus beyond just the risk behaviors and the downstream outcomes of health that I mentioned in the previous slide, such as diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension, and that we really need to shift more upstream in our understanding of this. And public health is that overarching, framework that provides that. But in this country, historically, healthcare has really gotten the attention and has really driven healthcare and health policy across the country. And we need to work to kind of shift and broaden that. But we can see from this that really the living conditions, as well as the structures and the policies, and then ultimately the root causes and the systems of power that create oppression around white supremacy and classism and racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and xenophobia really are what impact these downstream contexts of how people experience health. And you can imagine in a time of COVID, it's just exacerbated. The worst of health is exacerbated. Also deeper to this context and I think analysis is really understanding this connection to colonization. And this is a global phenomenon. But here we know in the United States that colonization, as says here, was the way that our economic system was extracted and capitalism was created. And it was supported by our systems of supremacy and domination. And it was necessary really to keep wealth and power accumulated in the hands of the colonizers and ultimately their financiers. And this has had, as in this diagram, and it says to trauma, this has had impacts on generations and across generations, has led to trauma as well as increased inflammation within the body. And so it's important then to then connect the dots to what does that long-term kind of chronic stress create? Having the experience of the injustice as it relates to systems of racism or gender oppression or classism, understanding that these systems create differential access to resources and power differentials and imbalances, as well as differential living conditions. All of this stressful on the human body, on conditions, and on people, and on communities, and it increases the stress levels within bodies, as well as actually can shape and reshape how DNA is expressed within our bodies as well, ultimately leading to the health inequities that exist within our communities across this country. I believe we have to have this deeper context and analysis for what creates and produces health inequities in the first place. And we see within this slide here, and so during COVID-19, we see this impact not just in our COVID-19 testing and our death data, but now this larger analysis of our population health data. And this just recently came out, and the latest analysis from the CD shows that, you know, overall life expectancy dropped by 1 whole year in the first half of 2020, going from 79.8 coming to 79.8 in 2020, and it was 78.8 now in 2019. I said that a little backwards, I'm so sorry. 79.8 in 2019 and 78.8 in 2020. And so, however, when you look and disaggregate the data, the life expectancy decline was largest amongst Blacks, whose life expectancy dropped almost 3 years in just 1 year. And so it's really important to note that before COVID-19, the US already had experienced profound levels of excess deaths among minoritized and marginalized groups, excuse me. And these inequities in COVID mortality are already, you know, adding to a major new component to our already unjust landscape. And then when we now come to looking at our vaccination data, the story is exactly the same. Black and Latino Americans who have the highest mortality and death rates appear least likely to have received a vaccine so far. Very promising news in our indigenous communities, and the Indian Health Service has really worked a lot to distribute hundreds of thousands of doses across the country, and we see vaccination rates pretty high. But important to note with this data, and another challenging gap, is that we don't have much data. We have very limited data. In only 27 states and DC are really reporting race and ethnicity data at this particular time. And so in discussing our political pivot points, I think it's important to look across history, and political pivot points historically have greatly impacted our policy on the local, state, and federal level. And these next 2 slides that I'll show, I'm not going to go in great depth to illustrate, but what I'm going to try to do is to illustrate how policy has been used to deliberately eradicate, control, oppress, and harm people, ultimately leading to suffering and early death. And so these slides also represent these windows of opportunity as a reflection of swings of political pendulums, whether they were left or right or center, that created space and better recognized injustice experienced for marginalized people through policy and political action. So you can kind of see these arcs of going up and down based on these political swings. But underlying really to all of this and this momentum through all of these arcs towards justice is really the continuous struggle and advocacy by indigenous people and descendants of African peoples and other historically marginalized people to either gain recognition for their sovereignty or the right to self-determination or justice under law, work towards freedom and liberation. And so in 2020, we saw the further rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, both here in the United States and globally after the public murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police. And this moment really allowed for greater realization and amplification of the movement for Black lives, existing guiding principles and strategies that already included broader actions for racial injustice, specifically health inequity and health equity. The exposures of from COVID and the consequence of the pandemic response in people being home, really saturated and consistently interacting with forms of media, the public murder of George Floyd, really all came together to create this pivotal moment in our country's dialogue around racism, as well as the structural and social drivers that impact health in a way that we have not even seen before or experienced before. Even our own AMA, the American Medical Association, in the summer released a pledge saying that, we are going to work to actively dismantle racism throughout policies and practices throughout healthcare. This was really a new step for AMA to explicitly do this, and our House of Delegates actually put forward and passed anti-racism policies in the fall. And then at the end of 2020, as most of us are very well aware, in the beginning of 2021, we saw significant political change at the federal level, both at the executive and legislative branches. And there's some hope and opportunity that this political change can build off of the historically unheard requests and demands of racial and health justice experts and organizers to reimagine and redesign a more just America. Based on the early action via executive orders calling for equity throughout all aspects of federal government, and even the configuration of the COVID Health Equity Task Force, which is tremendously diverse, it really signals the beginning of commitments to accountability beyond just performance and declarative statements. And so as we move towards how does this impact, the legal space and policy space, I think critical to this is how we are going to move to, and I mentioned this earlier, to really challenge these narratives that completely undermine equity. And we need to have a different set of value targets when starting to create these structures and build these structures, reimagine these structures and policies and redesigning them. And I'm not going to go in great detail with these, but these are the narratives that exist that really undermine the individualism, feeling that race is a biological construct when we know it's not, the othering of people, the meritocracy, that this idea that we can just pick ourselves up by our bootstraps, the exceptionalism that exists, the zero-sum game, the myth of that, and then the myth of the hierarchy of human value based on skin color, white supremacy, all undermine health equity. And if we don't challenge those values, then it's really hard to advance equity. And I think this is our opportunity at this point in time to start doing that. And so to close, when we're considering the legal and policy impacts, the opportunity that exists ahead for actualizing equity and justice in health is the broadness of what areas of law relate and how they relate to health. And that much of health-related law is public health and public law that affects all of society. The challenge is, again, shifting our nation's narrative on what creates health beyond just healthcare and access to it. We know access to healthcare is absolutely critical and important, and we've been working on that in this country, of course. And we have a new administration that's really focused on that. But that focus alone in terms of creating health is highly insufficient. And so the opportunity for greater consciousness that all policy is health policy, the social drivers that impact health are exceptionally broad, and hence many areas of law affect health, such as tax, employment, immigration, and housing and criminal law. This health and health equity in all policies approach allows for a tighter connection and analysis of the health and equity impacts of laws and decisions made today and moving forward. And to do this meaningfully, as was mentioned in the previous conversation, is that we as policymakers and lawmakers who are often actually distal and not proximate to communities who are experiencing the injustice must do a better job to value, acknowledge, and integrate the voices and ideas and experiences of those not marginalized or those who are marginalized within this country. I just want to thank the authors and my co-authors across the AMA for helping to support in building this presentation and co-authoring this piece for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up is Professor Resnick.
Hi, I'm not sure, I'm trying to share my screen. So let me see, I don't know if that's happening yet because my screen is a bit truncated, but let me see about sharing the screen. Hold on, I don't even think you see me as a video. Now you should be able to see me. And I'm hoping you're seeing my screen. which I'll say pausing.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
then we need slideshow. And if it works from the beginning, we'll be okay. Are we good?
Great.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And so that's one way at a very practical level to thank the conveners who've been holding our hands for several weeks and months patiently with 1,000 emails back and forth. So many thanks to you all for bringing us together in this joint endeavor. Second, I, like others, are here as part of a group. Dr. Jamie Meyer, Nat Oswela, and myself have been working and thinking about this, working in litigation as well as working in writing around it. And the topic is about the interaction between COVID and people in detention. And in order to have this conversation, for me at least, one needs to think ex ante about the world we were inhabiting before COVID was the vivid presence it is. We're in medias res in interacting with COVID, or that may be a cheerful account. If it's only the middle, we're halfway there. And then what it is that can be understood or seen or known differently or the same in light of COVID. In order to do that, we have to go, you need a baseline, and here, here she said, hopefully in terms of next, there, whoops, okay, is the baseline. And the baseline is that in terms of detention, the reminder is, and so this is going to be a very quick 300 years in very short time, that in the 18th century, the invention of prison was heralded as the Enlightenment great innovation over branding and executions and sending people in a colonial imperial world to penal colonies. And within short order of incarcerations beginning came a view that of some of its many miseries. And so this etching after a painting at the Yale Center for British Art tells us something about understanding some of the miseries. So prisoners become a focus of concern for which a good deal of the response is, I'm sorry to report, not to say, okay, we better end this as also noxious, but instead we better build them better and more. So on that account, just quickly, again, now I'm moving to the I went from the 1800s to the 1900s, and this is a built environment of a major new prison in England that actually then becomes, in the 20th century, a poster of a horrific setting. And but then if I do get to the 20th century next, I'm now in Illinois in another sadly super observatory structure in the 1920s. And now I'm in California in the century that we're in. And so the first proposition in the United States, and I'm not just US centric, but focused as the exemplar, we have 2.5 million people in detention, in jails, facilities for migrants, immigrants, and also for people post-conviction as well as pre-conviction. What I've just described is an environment and a social political movement for the practice of incarceration during World War, in the wake of World War II, fascism, and the civil rights movement. Prisoners have, throughout the 250 or 300 years I've been sketching, sought and brought their pleas, sometimes through their own bodies or vivid demonstrations, to some media attention. And it is law that comes into the story because basically, although prisons are generated through law, the practices inside them were basically lawless in the sense of an understanding that once people were in detention, there was no legal regime. And the credit for changing that understanding goes first and foremost to people like this. It's not easy to read on the screen. This is Winston Talley. It's 1965 in Arkansas. Arkansas whipped its prisoners, and Talley, in his handwriting, "Destroy the whip" is his plea there in his handwritten complaint. So people who are in detention were re-theorizing prison permissibility for many years, but we start seeing them seeking law as a form of argument to say, as they petition courts, legislators, others, to stop the behavior as an impermissible form of punishment, even if the social order could punish in some form. And so you have him, in addition to the individual petitioner's handwriting, and the reason these are his words and his ideas that are bringing us to the second half of the 20th century. You also have very famous collective actions. This is the uprising at Attica Prison in upstate New York. And here I'm obviously saying in the United States, it's not an Arkansas or Southern story, it's a national story. And here is the collective action then that is tragically met by Governor Nelson Rockefeller at the time by calling in troops. And what you see in the next quick slide is that in 1971, 43 people died as a consequence of that encounter. And what is very important is that Attica was not perceptibly better or worse than other maxes around the country. Attica is every prison, and every prison is Attica. And around the United States, prisoners in individual and collective actions seek interventions. And here is now I'm in Alabama with one handwritten, one typed, as we look to see. And so over the course of the next few decades, prisoners, lawyers, social movements, their communities engage courts. And here's one artifact, which is in 1976, the US Supreme Court says for the first time, and here we're getting to healthcare, that there is an affirmative obligation for prison officials to provide some kind of health care as a matter of US 8th Amendment constitutional no cruel and unusual punishment law. And the burden is not easy, deliberate indifference to serious medical needs. At the time, this individual, Mr. Gamble in Texas, was in a system where there were 17,000 prisoners for one doctor. And so this unrepresented person made his way eventually with lawyers to the Supreme Court, which announced this affirmative, albeit not far from perfect, obligation of care, which has generated a significant amount of understanding that you're not supposed to let people rot, but now we'll move forward and put COVID into the screen. So first, with a shout out and thanks to Johns Hopkins, there are a variety of different number compilations. And here's just putting you into a couple days ago in terms of numbers that are all sadly familiar in the United States. If I go now to the focus on the detention, the New York Times, as of last July, told us that the top 20 clusters were prisons. And again, I'm just trying to be clear that I'm not showing a story of any one part of the United States, but all over. And the other point of this slide, as Dr. Meyer reminds me each time we pull it out, is that it's not that you can track this in relationship to the rates or the public health policies in a state. You're looking at congregate settings, which are putting people at great risk. And now with a thanks to another, you're also looking at quite remarkable immediate research by an array of people trying to get some understanding of this. And you see that staff are getting COVID at 3.2 higher, and prisoners are getting it yet 1.4. And if you look at where the lines cross, you realize that initially staff are, of course, one of the people's bringing things in and out of the facility, and then the facility itself is a huge source of a problem. So here, thanks to the Marshall Project, we're looking at the reported numbers of cases and deaths. And the caveat is that we don't have comprehensive testing obligations nor comprehensive reporting obligations. So these numbers are as good as we can get and totally admirable to have, and then not actually there. And so here, for those who don't spend much time in relationship to detention, the image that they're kind of closed environments is a misdescription because of new intake staff, vendors, contractors, visitors, attorneys, and people, individuals moving in and out. Even in COVID, there are lockdowns and no movement institutions, but you'll see, obviously, the staff are moving in and out. So one is their permeability of detention. And then the next is that you'll also need to see that as organized in the United States, there's nothing private about it. And so, of course, what I've just shown you visually is a complete clash with the practices of incarceration as they are in the United States and the guidance from the CDC, which tells us that what are we all supposed to do? And here I'm always self-conscious about not using we in a Riven world, but here all of us are supposed to stay away, screen, quarantine, test, have distances from each other. These are all there. CDC's guidance doesn't say actually for detention settings, which are congregate settings, what is key, an awkward word called de-densification, which is to say, to have fewer people in, and of course, vaccination as well. So here, of course, other institutional speakers like the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine do speak the let people out decarceration word, and moreover call for vaccine and the pairing of staff and of detainees in the same story. And then on the public health front, you're also seeing sophisticated modeling to talk about this. And here now, quoting directly from Dr. Jamie Meyer, who's put declarations into litigation in many detention cases since a year ago. Prison health is public health. And when you're looking at detention facilities, you're also looking at their effect, if there is the provision of healthcare, on the communities and the healthcare facilities around them. So how to understand what I've just tried to sketch of 300 years is that the commitment to detention in dense congregate settings is a huge problem before COVID. The risk and scariness of illness in detention doesn't take COVID. And anyone who has themselves and or had friends and family in detention or in any facility that there are other people who are getting sick with the flu as well as other diseases know about the risk and anxiety that can be occasioned, and the 100% dependence on the folks who keep you in. We've already heard in this very moving set of presentations that, of course, there are lots of people who cannot afford to distance because of the kind of work they do, and it's disproportionately peoples of color in class and race and gender are intersecting in painful ways in this arena like in all others. They're the can afford in this congregate setting and detention is people won't let people out. So there was and has been an ongoing our efforts either through legislation or executive activity and in courts to seek release, enlargement of the custody so that the person could be not in a congruent setting, but still officially in custody, home confinement, shortening sentences, compassionate release, parole, pardon. There's a whole bunch of these stories. And for anybody in the thicket of American legal law litigation, this is just an example. FCI Danbury is an hour from where I live and a place in which I've worked, and FCI Federal Prison in Danbury. And you can see a rush to a court, some initial relief, a form of a settlement, and literally 2 days ago above the fold in the New York Times, a headline that says that the federal prison system is not actually shielding its prisoners from the virus as one would have hoped, with litigation making a dent, but not getting anywhere far enough, and a huge pushback from some courts, particularly the United States Supreme Court and some appellate courts, which gets me back to the slide I showed earlier. So this idea that you can't be deliberately indifferent to serious medical needs, if taken at its straight face, as I who also have been involved in some of these lawsuits, argued and filed statements, that what COVID did was take what could have been a constitutional confinement and turned it into an unconstitutional confinement, because the fact of proximity was a form of, created both risk of injury and death. And as you can see, several judges said spontaneously, I never intended to sentence a person to disease or death. That's actually nowhere was there a statute authorizing such a sentence, nor coming back to whipping, would we think our political social order to be legitimate, echoing an earlier comment, ought to be in the context of thinking that that would be in any way permissible. Of course, what this underscores is the question of the permissibility of incarceration as a form of punishment, at least as it's practiced in the United States today. And so to close, I want to bring you to California. These pictures come from 2008. The US Supreme Court issued a decision in 2011. It's about radical overcrowding in the California prison system. And there's literally something out 2 days ago about the continued overcrowding, even quote unquote, with population drops, because of course the baseline is stunning. And so what you're looking at here is what they call a dorm, is this ridiculously overcrowded setting inside the facility. And then the cages that you're looking at, and these were photographs that Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion for the Supreme Court, appended to his opinion. So we're taking them from that public record. Those cages are where people who were described as having challenges emotionally, mentally, psychologically, were held while they were waiting for something that was called therapy, because these were the spaces. So this is to be very plain that what COVID is helping us to, is reminding, and the us again is a contested us because not everyone is there, is reminding and underscoring and maybe making vivid for some, but not for others, is the toleration of physical, personal injury that incarceration, detention encompasses, creates, produces, exacerbates, that is being tolerated around the United States for the 2.5 million. And therefore, in thinking about COVID normatively as well as descriptively, to posit it as a state of exception and emergency, it is what prisoners were living with before COVID. And it is COVID is underscoring, and many of the problems and much of the litigation that is COVID prompted is that there's terrible healthcare without COVID, even with injunctions and some way expanded degree of healthcare than there was. And so, of course, to close this is just a scattering of some of the many reports and writings, and there's lawsuits and there's databases that are that exist that are seeking quickly to capture a very troubling world that we are inhabiting. And the question is, which is the future looking, is how that we may see that some of us will understand or feel all the more deeply can be translated into different forms of social political action, and how to gather the legitimacy for a profound change. And that's where I come back to in medias res, which was we are unclear yet about it. In the sad report from the detention space, the commitment to detention has overwhelmed the commitment to safekeeping, because you can't keep people safe in the density in which most of the facilities of detention in the United States are now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Next is Eric Rodriguez.
There we go. Hopefully people can see my screen. There we go. So thank you for having me. So my talk is going to be discussing individual and structural factors that have fueled the COVID-19 disparities. And my apologies for anyone who feels that this is overlap with the presentation from Dr. Maybach. So I am a federal employee, so therefore I must disclose that I have no conflicts to declare, and that the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of the National Institutes of Health or the US federal government. So this is a background, oops, my apologies, that was some of what was just shown just now for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. This is as of Monday of 7-day average of 16,348 cases, 7-day average of 2,687 deaths, and a test positivity ratio average over the last 7 days of 5.2%. And just for all of our background knowledge, some basic biology, that COVID-19 is a single-stranded RNA virus that uses these red spike proteins to break into human cells. So even before COVID-19 existed, there were significant health disparities, and there are certain populations in particular that experience these disparities. These include racial and ethnic minorities, which I'll get to in a second, as defined by the US Census, less privileged socioeconomic status individuals, underserved rural residents, and sexual and gender minorities. But what is a health disparity? So health disparity is a health outcome that is worse in a population compared to a reference population. And generally this reference population is the largest of the populations and is the most advantaged. Social disadvantage results, at least in part, from having been subjected to discrimination and or from being underserved in healthcare. These are the US Census racial and ethnic categories, which I'm sure most all of you are familiar with. I will make two notes that South Asians, even though they are included in the Asian group, are different, particularly with respect to health outcomes. And among Latinas and Latinos, their family backgrounds include 20 Spanish-speaking countries. They're defined by intercontinental mixture over 500 years, and their degree of admixture differs by the country. So two factors that are some of the most important factors for health outcomes are race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. These two are fundamentally important to human research, clinical care, and population health. Race ethnicity predicts life expectancy, all-cause mortality, heart disease and diabetes outcomes, incidence and mortality in cancer, and now infection for COVID-19. And it explains and predicts these factors which are not otherwise fully explained by any other relationship to any other factor. Socioeconomic status is as robust a predictor of all-cause mortality as cigarette smoking and systolic blood pressure. These two, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, are essential to be aware of for communication strategies. And this should impact the types of messages, public health messages, that are created and the kinds of messengers that deliver such messages. This is an example of the likelihood of all-cause mortality by US annual household income level. You can see on the far right that compared to those with a household income of greater than 115,000, those with less than household income of less than $25,000 on the far left have 3 times the likelihood of death. But so how does racial inequity harm health? Well, racial inequity, as mentioned previously, can be conceptualized as a form of chronic stress or stress with long-term health effects. It's measured by questionnaires such as major life experiences or events, lifetime discrimination or everyday discrimination, and heightened vigilance. Chronic stress has a longitudinal effect on physical and mental health status. This includes racism and their effects on physiological measures such as systolic blood pressure, inflammatory markers, and cardiovascular risk factors, and discrimination and its impacts on health behaviors such as smoking, problem drinking, and substance use. There's other data that's linked chronic stress to other health outcomes, but that data is less robust than what I'm presenting here. And then there's structural racism. And structural racism is a history, culture, institutions, policies, and codified practices that perpetuate inequality by promoting an ideology of inferiority. It's organized into systems that categorizes, ranks, devalues, disempowers, and differentially allocates resources. And one of the cornerstones of structural racism is residential segregation. So how are COVID-19 and race and ethnicity related? So more than 50% of cases and about 45% of mortality related to COVID-19 are among Latinas and Latinos, African Americans and Blacks, and American Indians and Alaskan Natives. Yet these 3 groups only represent about 33% of the US population. So the disproportionate burden of COVID-19 on racial and ethnic minorities has persisted over the past year. So this isn't something that's changed as of lately. This is a bit of a busy slide, but I'd like to point your attention to the 3 red boxes. These are differences between the percent of COVID-19 deaths given the size of the population of that racial and ethnic group in the population. So in other words, the groups that are the most impacted by and the most burdened by COVID-19 with respect to deaths are Latinas and Latinos, African Americans and Blacks, and American Indians and Alaskan Natives. This is another way to look at that data. this is COVID-19 associated deaths from mid to late last year. The Latinas and Latinos, African Americans and Blacks, and American Indians and Alaskan Natives that make up 33% of the US population. They account for about 44%, as I mentioned, 45% of COVID-19 deaths. Another way to highlight this is the percent increase in deaths per week in 2020 compared to the average deaths per week in the US between 2015 and 2019. And this clear, far and away, Latinas and Latinos have had the largest increase in deaths just in the pandemic year of 2020 alone, compared to the past several years. This is the risk of COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations, and deaths by race and ethnicity. So one way to interpret this is by saying, for example, American Indians and Alaska Natives are 3.7 times more likely than whites to be hospitalized by COVID-19, or that African Americans or Blacks are 1.9 times more likely than whites to die from COVID-19. Genetics are not the greatest risk factor for COVID-19. So I'd like to introduce you, or reintroduce you from, as you've heard from other talks, to the social determinants of health. And I'm gonna group these into two groups for my talk: individual and structural determinants. So examples of individual determinants include demographics, including family background, urban or rural residence and or geographic region, cultural identity, religiosity and spirituality, language preference, numeracy, and literacy. Examples of structural determinants includes housing, green space, broadband internet, economic opportunity, transportation, schools, healthy food access, public safety, and discrimination. For those of you interested in learning more about social determinants of health, there is a website called the Phoenix Toolkit, PHENX. You can Google it and find down the bottom right corner a link to social determinants of health. So how are social determinants of health and COVID-19 infection related? Well, their underlying causes of the disproportionate burden by race and ethnicity are related to long-standing disparities and disadvantage. This was mentioned by Dr. Maybach. So example, lower economic opportunity may lead to higher proportions of public-facing jobs. Residential segregation may lead to crowding in housing and communities. And lower language proficiency and literacy may lead to ineffective and misunderstood messaging and messengers. There are higher rates of comorbid conditions and less access to healthcare also result in advanced disease and higher mortality. So worse, once you're infected, a worse case of COVID-19. These risk factors can be seen here. Most of them revolve around or include chronic disease. And this bar chart shows that when you put these risk factors together, and you look at certain groups based on social determinants, the groups with the highest percentages of 3 or more risk factors are those with less than a high school education, the bottom income quartile, or African Americans or Blacks. We have some challenges with respect to vaccines. So this is a questionnaire administered. This is the percent of US adults who say they would definitely or probably get a COVID-19 vaccine. This is just this is a little bit older data, but this is to show you that these things are not static. They've been changing over time, with the example on the box on the left and the box on the right showing that African Americans and Blacks and those with a high school education or less, or some college education, are the least likely to say they would definitely or probably get a COVID-19 vaccine. This is some newer data that there's been some improvements among African Americans and Blacks, but they're still much less likely to say they would get a vaccine. And this trend holds for even those who regularly get an influenza vaccine, 33% of African Americans and Blacks compared to 15% of whites. So why is this? Or what's one reason that could explain this? So this is data from 2015. This is the perception of unfair treatment. So the question was of participants. In the past 30 days, were you treated unfairly because of your racial and ethnic background in the store, workplace, a place of entertainment, dealing with police, or getting healthcare? So overall, 53% of African Americans or Blacks and 36% of Latinas and Latinos said that they were treated unfairly because of their race or ethnic background in any setting. Additionally, 12% of African Americans or Blacks and 14% of Latinas or Latinos reported being treated unfairly because of their race or ethnicity in healthcare. So this opens questions for trust in clinicians and institutions, and if they differ, and the role of unconscious bias. So I'll leave you with my email address for those that may be further interested in social determinants of health, and the links for the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities for further information on COVID-19 related disparities and social determinants.
Thank you so much. Now, last but not least, we have Tess Wise.
Thank you so much. Let me just get these slides going. All right. Hopefully you can see it all now. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Tess Wise, and our paper is called COVID-19 and National Public Health Regimes. I'm a visiting professor of political science at Amherst College, and I'm really excited to present this co-authored work with my fantastic co-authors, Gally Katz-Nielsen, Carmel Shakar, and Andrea Campbell. So if you were like me, you spent way too much time in 2020 doom scrolling COVID-19 news and feeling very pessimistic about the ability of the world to cope with this global health crisis. As the year rolled on, however, COVID-19 success stories began to emerge, first in places like South Korea, which stood out even amongst the group of wealthy OECD nations for its comprehensive response. Then in places like Thailand and Cambodia, where despite proximity to China and early infections, the public health response was proving successful in containing the virus. Americans began to feel jealous of countries like Senegal, where despite a fragile healthcare system, 24-hour test results and widespread mask wearing were implemented without a fuss. Moreover, America was not alone in being a laggard, with paragons of development like Switzerland and Belgium also struggling. Determining exactly why certain countries have succeeded while others have failed will require on-the-ground observation and analysis of data that doesn't fully exist yet. In the meantime, we explore a much more rudimentary question. Did countries' public health profiles before the pandemic influence their early pandemic response? To answer this question, we brought together cross-national data on upstream and downstream public health factors to create a public health snapshot of the world before the pandemic. In deciding what to capture in our snapshot, we relied on the idea of public health regimes, developed by Ashtana and Halliday, who define public health regimes as a country's political, legal, social, cultural, economic, and organizational structures related to public health. We relied primarily on World Bank data, which contains a significant amount of United Nations data as well, and we combined this with indicators of fractionalization collected by Alesina et al. And polity scores, which measure democratization from the Center for Systemic Peace. Using national averages over the past 10 years, we were able to create a data set with this information for 117 countries. We use a statistical method called principal component analysis, or PCA, to describe the data. PCA projects high-dimensional data onto a lower dimensional space. Humans aren't great at imagining more than 3 dimensions, but to give you an idea of what this is like, you might imagine a complex shape like a mountain being reduced to its most basic features, but retaining the key axes of variation that describe it. So when we take our complex mountain of data and project it down into 2 dimensions, we're actually able to capture more than 50% of the original variation in the data. This figure, which I'm sorry is probably a little hard to read, is a visualization of what that projection looks like. The red lines indicate the variables that went into the model, and variables that predict each other point in the same direction. Then we have overlaid the positions of our countries on top. We call the first dimension of variation, shown along the x-axis, the development dimension. So looking from left to right on the graph, we can see countries like Switzerland and Canada in the top left-hand corner, near indicators of political stability and the percentage of GDP spent on health. In the middle of this dimension, so the middle of the graph, are countries like Brazil, Colombia, and China. And then on the far right, we have countries such as Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Liberia, near indicators for ethnic fractionalization and population growth rate. Now looking along the y-axis, we call this dimension the social priorities dimension. Looking at the bottom center of the graph, we see countries like China, Jordan, Algeria, and Morocco, and then they've got this indicator for military spending pointing towards them. And as we look up, we see countries like Botswana and South Africa, and the indicator for female labor force participation. The indicators for democracy, so that's the polity one, and electoral and legislative competitiveness, which is IEC and LIEC. They're sort of here up in the center. They also point towards the top of the graph. And from this graph alone, we can start to see the clusters that are developing within the data. So you have some developed countries clustered at the top left, middle income countries in the middle, and developing countries clustering at the top right. We then use a second statistical technique called k-means clustering to create groups of countries within this two-dimensional space. So this figure is the same as the previous one, but I've taken off the variable indicators and I'm showing our groupings indicated by color. So in red, we have cluster 1, which contains just China and India. And we call this cluster the emerging giants because these two countries are clustered due to their large populations that set them apart from all the other countries in our data. In this yellowy green color, we have cluster 2, which contains countries like Brazil, Thailand, Indonesia, and South Africa. We call this cluster the poor democracies. In green, we have cluster 3, which contains countries like Ghana, Senegal, Angola, and Haiti. We call this group the developing semi-democracies as they have higher income per capita than the poor democracies, but lower polity scores. Cluster 4, which is shown in blue, contains Ukraine, Morocco, Algeria, Bangladesh, and Jordan. And we refer to this cluster as the middle-income semi-autocracies. And finally, in purple, we have our high-income democracies. So taking these clusters, we might ask how these different countries and these different regimes do in the context of COVID-19. So in this figure, we examine how the different public health regimes do at slowing the spread of COVID-19. Along the x-axis, we're measuring the number of days from the first reported case of COVID-19 to the 10,000th reported case. And we're using the Oxford University's COVID-19 tracking data to do this. Along the y-axis, we measure the average level of government containment during 2020, again using the Oxford data. And then the countries are colored according to their public health regime. So what do we make of this? Well, rather than distinct clusters, what we see is a big blob of data. The purple high-income democracies, that is the countries with high levels of development and social priorities that should support public health, they're all over the place. And to the degree that they cluster, it's at the left of the graph, indicating that they were the quickest to reach the 10,000 case mark. The developing semi-democracies, shown in green, actually do quite a bit better. From this graph, we can also see that Thailand stands out as an outlier with nearly a year between the first case and the 10,000th case of COVID-19 in the country. So we did some other analyses, not just looking at cases, but also looking at deaths. And so in this graph, we examined the time between the first reported COVID death in the country and the 1,000th reported death. And that's displayed along the x-axis. Now this reduces our observations significantly because many countries have incomplete death data and or low numbers of reported deaths, but we still have a fair number. And along the y-axis, we've included the percentage of the population aged 65 and older. Although we again observe a pileup of high-income democracies on the left side of the graph, indicating that they went from 0 to 1,000 deaths in a short amount of time, what we also observe in this graph is that demography is not destiny. South Korea stands out as a major outlier with one of the oldest populations, but also the longest time to reach 1,000 COVID-19 deaths. To make sense of our statistical results, we conducted case studies on China, India, Thailand, South Korea, Israel, and the United States. For time purposes, I'm just going to present South Korea, Thailand, and Israel today. The colors on this table are like green light, yellow light, red light, with the best indicators shown in dark green and the worst indicators shown in dark red. In South Korea, we see a country that exceeds even its cluster 5 peers on health infrastructure measures like hospital beds and sanitation, though as I noted on the previous slide, it also exceeds its peers on the percentage of population over age 65. Our additional research on South Korea revealed that its success at containing COVID-19 and preventing deaths in the early stage of the pandemic, despite its close proximity to China, was largely attributed to lessons learned from its flawed response with the Middle East respiratory syndrome in 2015. Because of this, Koreans were already accustomed to wearing masks and were accepting of contact tracing efforts. And this was true even when those efforts raised significant privacy concerns. A final important thing to note is that South Korea's polity score, which measures the degree to which its democracy is consolidated, is high relative to the world average, but it's lower than the 9.5 average for its high-income democracy peers. And this is perhaps part of what is facilitating some of this more aggressive data collection from its population. Thailand is another country that really stands out in our data as a COVID-19 success story. Here we can see that Thailand's ability to slow the spread stands out relative to the world and also relative to its peers, despite the fact that it's geographically and economically close to China, and despite being the first country outside of China to confirm a COVID-19 case, which happened on January 13th, 2020. Now, since 2002, Thailand has provided comprehensive health benefits to its entire population through a universal coverage scheme with a high level of financial risk protection, as well as voice and accountability provided through legislative provisions and a deliberative process. However, as we look at Thailand's other indicators, we see a pattern that we might describe as governance without democracy. In terms of basic sanitation and government effectiveness, Thailand is far better than its peers. However, relative to those same peers, Thailand has a less democratic government, and it's not even technically a democracy at the moment. In March 2019, Thailand held its first elections for the first time since 2014, when a military coup overthrew its democratically elected government. Unfortunately, the 2019 election was widely recognized as being designed to prolong and legitimize the military's dominant role in Thailand's government, according to reports from the Freedom House Watch Group. Israel is a high-income democracy that fell right in the middle of the pack at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite a very strong government response, Israel was unable to do much to slow the spread of cases, which went from 1 to 10,000 in just 48 days. Since this time, Israel has emerged as a leader on vaccination, and that highlights highlighting that it's a leader in an area that we haven't really yet considered in our data that we hope to do as we continue this project. And in addition, what we see is Israel conforming to a similar pattern as South Korea and Thailand in exhibiting high levels of governance with lower levels of democracy than its peers. This was put on display when the Israeli Ministry of Health took advantage of Israel's strong digital health and surveillance capabilities to implement digital tracking, something that was in place for months before the initiative was struck down by the Israeli High Court of Justice as needing to come from legislative authorization rather than just executive action. So what do we make of this analysis? Well, the first point that we want to emphasize is that our indicators of development should not be taken as representing primordial distinctions among countries, but rather socially constructed ones. These indicators, primarily collected from the World Bank, really reflect how institutions like the World Bank see the world, and they are collected and disseminated with a particular agenda. In the 1990s, this agenda was referred to as the Washington Consensus, which could be summarized as advice to stabilize, privatize, and liberalize. By the mid-2000s, a spate of studies had really called into question this original advice, and scholars like Joseph Stiglitz sought to pursue a new consensus that put more emphasis on social factors and institutions. However, the massive growth of global finance during this period led many to wonder whether this post-Washington Consensus was really a Wall Street consensus. And most of our indicators, such as the World Bank indicators of governance and the other key indicators in our data, were collected under the Washington Consensus and post-Washington Consensus paradigm. The failure of the United States and many other rich democracies to slow the spread of COVID-19 highlights the known decline of the Washington and post-Washington Consensus. And in addition, our analysis gives some hints about what a post-COVID consensus in public health might look like. What we see in South Korea, Thailand, and Israel point us toward two key conclusions. First, that demography is not destiny. A good public health system can cope with an aging population or other suboptimal demographic features. Secondly, we notice a potentially worrying pattern of governance with less democracy. Countries that can surveil and monitor their populations and take quick action without legislative or popular oversight may be at an advantage when faced with a pandemic, but we might worry long-term about the knock-on effects of governance without democracy, especially if it becomes a model that other countries seek to follow. And thank you so much for listening to this brief presentation. I look forward to getting any questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for your fantastic presentations. It's been a pleasure. So now we are going to go into the Q&A. So coming right off of Tess's presentation, our first question is for Tess, specifically from Twitter. So it's about the number of cases in your study. So is the number of cases normalized to the population size of the country? So is it representative and measured in that way?
That's a great question. We tried a bunch of different models, and what we actually ended up looking at was not the number of cases overall, but basically the time to go from that first case to the 10,000th case. And so that's not actually normalized because that's just a matter of how fast it spread, regardless of your country's population size. But our results generally hold when we look at other measures of cases as well. Thanks.
Thank you. So our next question is for Professor Resnick. So it's looking at so the incarceration system has produced a vicious cycle of discrimination and it's disproportionately harmed the rights of the prison population. So one of the measures that's been taken, that's been discussed a lot, is quarantine and isolation. So the questioner asks about Professor Jamelia Morgan's work and how she argues that solitary confinement has caused devastating harm on prisoners with intellectual disabilities specifically. How can we provide a human rights-based approach to health and preserve the rights of prisoners with disabilities during the pandemic within the US prison system, focusing on this issue of isolation and quarantine?
Thanks. Professor Morgan was a Lyman Fellow as well, and we are currently co-teaching with others a course called In Prison, From Construction to Abolition. And we at the Lyman Center have done a sequence of studies mapping solitary confinement in the United States in 2014 between 80 to 100,000 people, according to reports from the institutions that detain them, were in 22 hours or more, 30 days or more. As of about a year ago, about 60,000 people were in 22 hours on average for 15 days or more, and at least 3,000 of those people were described by the systems that detain them as seriously mentally ill. And some people are in for decades and for years, as well as shorter periods of time. So the quick answer is yes, we're exceedingly engaged with the challenges of solitary confinement, and the short answer is there should be none of that. Segregation need not be the kind of profound sensory deprivation or isolation that is commonplace in solitary confinement. And you can separate people who could do harm to others without putting them in the sensory deprived settings that are so common in solitary. Furthermore, and on the very back end of the list of references, the AMEND is a fabulous USF-based institution that has put out a series of papers about why quarantine, medical quarantine, and degrees of isolation is not solitary confinement. It is the case that in the terribly built environment called US jails and detention centers, some of those centers are using sometimes cells they had left behind for detaining in isolation. I mean, people are living in so-called medical quarantine, sometimes in groups or pods in dining halls, but they're also sometimes living in the kinds of cells that are abysmal. And the quick answer there is, of course, that's not the right way to keep people. Some of the systems report that they are using those housing, but not the conditions are better. And of course, the answer is to change the infrastructure. In terms of legal hooks in the United States, our courts have tolerated a vast amount under the US constitutional framework, as well as resisted international understandings of what would be more decent. But it's not just a US story, because there's huge amounts of these problems around the world, some operating under, quote, better forms of prison regulation rules and rights frameworks.
Thank you. So the next question is about the social determinants of health. So one of the speakers proposed that race is a factor in the influence of factors on health, and one said that it's racism but not race. Could those speakers elaborate on their positions and how they conflict or don't actually conflict?
Well, I guess go ahead, Dr. Maybank.
No, you go ahead first. No.
So they don't conflict. The one is a matter of data measurement. You know, the way we often one of the most common ways to assess relationships with respect to minority health and health disparities just have a rely on the self-reported identified race and ethnicity of the person. And so it would appear from any report that it's the race of the person, but no, it's not. I did talk, and I did highlight this as well. It's the factors that are related to someone's race that aren't necessarily assessed in surveys and data. So they don't conflict so much as one is often just is a more common, just frequent way to assess a question versus actually taking the time to include like the follow-up, the last item that I listed on unequal treatment.
So I'm glad that question was posed because I think it is conflicting. And I think this is, gets to my point of my presentation about the importance of how you move forward and really have value targets for this work. And one of them I mentioned about the myth or the misunderstanding about the construction of race in this country as well as globally. It is absolutely critical that we all understand and embrace, and NIH has come out, has said this is what the Human Genome Study said, that race is not a biological construct, it is a social construct. So race itself, yes, can be used as a descriptor in terms of experience of people. However, to make any kind of conclusions about the impact of race causing disease or leading disease would be totally false, because it's not a biological construct, it's a social construct and a political construct. And so in order to understand the experience of what's happening with people of varying races and ethnicities, we have to look at the systems and the structures that have set up the social conditions of which people can live in. And in our country, it's very clear, it's very rooted, again, in our lens and our belief of the hierarchy of human value based on skin color, with white being supreme. So white supremacy and then racism as a system structures opportunities, assigns value based on skin color, disadvantaging people of color and advantaging whites. Those are the root causes. And so this is, to me, this is a critical point of how we have to move forward in this work. I do know and believe we need to evolve our narratives. We have to evolve the language that we use to describe people, even away from minority, is problematic, and really speak to what, again, I think just more so the root causes and using language that better shapes a narrative that really also embodies and integrates the relationship of communities to power or lack of power, perceived power. And then just lastly, this is part of the point of the work that AMA did, that this past year in passing a policy that says we need to rid our healthcare system of racial essentialism and recognizing that race is a social and not a biological construct, as well as eliminating race as a proxy for ancestry, genetics, biology, research, and clinical practice, because we end up doing more harm than good. And I think there is a growing sense of awareness around that and movement and activation.
Thank you. I actually have a question personally for Joelle, and also Tess, and your team may have some comments on it. So I've been looking a lot at this challenges, especially with Jacobson, to different COVID measures and how different countries and different courts have been approaching them. So I know, Tess, your presentation really focuses on the national culture, and Joelle, you talked a lot more about powers. Wondering if you think that, like, from like a human rights framework, coming with the right to health and the rights that aren't present in the United States for the most part, how do you think that's coming into play? Do you think it's really a legal rights-based approach, or do you think it's a cultural approach? And how do you think that, like, the US context versus other countries, how does that compare?
I will volunteer first opinion, but first I'd like to, just on any questions of the right to health, I will pass over to my wonderful co-author, Alicia, just on giving some first impressions on this.
So my first impression, first of all, thanks very much for the question. My first impression would be to say that we've seen in countries that have enshrined the right to health in legislation or as constitutional rights, we have seen an increasing amount of litigation during this period, including in Brazil, for example, where, as a number of speakers noted, there's a similarly populist president who's not doing enough. But across those countries, we've seen a rise in right to health litigation, and including in carceral settings too, where in prison situations, there have been unconstitutional states of affairs declared. So there are significant differences. Whether the enshrinement of the right to health has been a significant indicator of the policies adopted is more unclear, I would say.
Can I just add that under the US Constitution, prisoners have a form of a right to health. But so this is the question of the content and the implementation, and how it either co-ventures with or not rights to other forms of safety and or perceived toleration of what constitutes health. So the wealth of discussion here is to give a rich account of what could be well-being and how it's being disabled from all the vectors you've heard about. So that's the abstract right to health is the question of what's the engine, and bringing Dan into the story in terms of climate is clearly engaged in this story too.
What I might briefly add from privilege of now running a second symposium a year later is, while we expected an increase in litigation as initial deference of the courts towards governmental responses in that first stage of the pandemic hasn't really appeared. We are seeing somewhat of an increase of litigation, but one thing that's really critical and important in the context of the discussion of the right to health, just as Alicia said, is we're almost not getting to that stage of proceedings. We're seeing a lot of courts worldwide simply saying this is not a matter for our jurisdiction. They are hands off entirely. But we can still compare it, not only in the context of Europe and a study that I've just run, with those of parliaments who are just entirely hands-off on any degree of scrutiny. So it's almost multiple stages before we get to real and meaningful discussion of the right to health in practice.
Well, thank you all. Before we conclude, I want to give each of you an opportunity, a question we're asking all the panelists at all these different panels. If you could summarize the one big takeaway that you'd want from your chapter, either to be a tweet or a newspaper headline, what would that one sentence big takeaway be? We can start with Professor Resnick.
I'm not very good at one sentences, and I was actually one of the things as I was listening to all the panel was the questions about inter-border, inter-jurisdictional obligations and co-venturing. So I guess if I'm supposed to summarize, it's be an utter skeptic of claims of exceptionalism.
That's great. Maybe, or Dr. Miller?
Did you say me? Your voice became muffled at that moment, so I wasn't cracking.
Sorry, Dr. Maybank.
Yeah. I didn't hear the last part. Okay, great. You all have been doing great on the tweets. So I saw the tweets. You've been giving the one-liners. I think just based on what the question was, I think it's just imperative that we understand that racism and white supremacy are the fundamental causes of why these inequities exist. And we need to name that.
Definitely. Next, Tess Wise.
So I would say on the global scale, to look out for governance with less democracy.
Professor Farber.
I guess I would say that COVID has highlighted the weaknesses in our systems for dealing with global risks, but also has created some opportunities that might allow us to strengthen our response to climate change, and in the process address some of the disparities between groups that have been the focus of today's discussion.
Thank you. Eric Rodriguez.
I think I would say that it's fundamentally important to make sure these populations of interest are actually included in the research and the work that we do, in the participants that are studied and in the research that are actually conducting the research, the investigations.
Thank you. And last but not least, Joelle.
I'm going to abuse privilege and politeness of this panel and have two and leave the last word to my co-author. First, hold on to the rule of law. It is the one true value that we're seeing through the pandemic. And Alicia?
I'd say COVID and the inequities revealed highlight problems in our democratic institutions and processes.
Excellent. Well, I hope everyone can join me in thanking the panelists again for their fantastic presentations. I learned so much and very much appreciated it. Thank you so much. And if, so we have one more presentation, one more panel, excuse me, left in our COVID in the Law Forum series. It will be on March 16th on the healthcare system in the age of COVID-19. We hope you can join us then. Well, thank you everybody again. Have a great afternoon and hope to see you again. Bye now.